Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. Today we wanted to announce that we're going to try a live stream coming up. It'll be on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, 2025. So if you can, grab your margarita and we'll talk some management. Today we would like to ask you for a little bit of feedback. So to make that conversation interesting to you, we're looking for what is currently challenging you at work, either managing yourself or managing others. You can leave them down in the comments section, or you can check the show notes and we'll have a link to where you can leave us some of your ideas for that conversation. Now on to the show. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and my co-host is Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow.
And we want to start out with a little bit of business. So here's our business end of things. We would really appreciate it if you could leave some comments on YouTube or follow or subscribe, depending on which platform you're listening to us on. That really helps and we really appreciate it. Today we are going to talk about loss aversion and the impact that has
being scared of loss.
Yeah, on ourselves and the decisions that we make, and sometimes how we treat other people in organizations.
Yeah, leads us to make bad decisions, inferior choices, lower quality of life, I would say.
Okay, so let's talk about taking risks when we shouldn't.
Yes, gambling when we shouldn't comes from probably, I think it was 78. It's been a long time, but almost nobody's heard of it, even though it's famous within the nerd circles. Nerd alert. Prospect theory. Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, which basically was one of the first papers of behavioral economics. And
they are amazing.
Yep, laid out the basic finding that when we're down, when we're behind, we tend to gamble more. And then the other piece of this, and we'll talk about both pieces of it, when we're ahead, we pull back when we shouldn't. So basically, if I can slightly exaggerate to make a point, humans are so bad at risk that when we shouldn't risk, we do. And when we should, we don't. That's the basic finding of prospect theory. And it pops up everywhere. And so it pops up, if you've ever been to a casino and found yourself a little bit behind, for many people, the tendency.
Yeah, you feel like if you just keep playing, you will catch up.
Hit it. Yeah,
but the keep playing means you got to actually put down more money to make up for the previous losses.
Yeah, I keep putting it down. And that's the gambling when you shouldn't. Or that's the having a business that doesn't succeed and then being desperate and taking a bigger gamble on an even less likely business.
Or what I have seen a number of times, because I once TA'd for a class that was on organizational corruption. So we would have these people come in and they were literally on parole for,
yes, actual
crimes.
Parolees.
Yes.
Yeah.
They'd come in with, a sheriff and
really?
Yeah.
Why would a sheriff bring in somebody on parole?
I think it was a sheriff. It was definitely a police type officer.
Yeah, but why would you're on parole?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was because they helped us find them. Like they were their parolees, or I don't I don't know, but they we definitely had officials in the classroom kind of sitting there.
All right. Okay.
And so anyway, many of their stories start with sort of an innocence where they're behind and they're worried about everybody who's depending on them. And so then they take these huge risks and they try to bring it back. And sometimes those huge risks mean that like they're doing things that are actually illegal. Like, you have, say, like you are in finance and you have clients, they should all have separate accounts. But all of a sudden you're in risk and nobody's going to notice if you're, taking a little here to pay over there. That is the beginning of a Ponzi scheme. And many of their stories start out with, I'm not actually a bad person. I just need to get through this bad time and protect all these people who are underneath me.
Yeah.
And so they wind up, in that prospect theory doesn't necessarily mean that you will do something illegal, but it's a risk. What they're doing is taking a huge risk when really they need to deal with reality. And the reality is this business doesn't operate at this level given the current circumstances, and do the hard work of figuring your way through legitimately. But many times those stories often begin with sort of a prospect theory element to it, where they're taking bigger risks than they should.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's periodically you'll see in the news about certain pension funds that get in trouble because they need to have so much money to fulfill their financial commitments, and what they've chosen to invest in didn't work. And so they have to keep climbing the scale of riskier and riskier investments. And that's also, it's all the same. It's basically, weirdly, after losses, we're more likely to gamble. And that's often to our detriment.
And the underlying reason for that is we just feel the losses more than the gains. And so when you're feeling the loss, you are trying to do whatever you can to basically not have that loss, to erase that loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Standard human operating to feel the losses more, because it goes back to our wiring from thousands of years ago. The losses could kill you, but the gains won't. You're already living. So the gains don't make you go from dead to alive, right? The gains are just gains.
Well, I mean, that is mirrored in all sorts of theories. It's mirrored in the hedonic treadmill. It's the same thing. You adjust very fast to the gains.
Yeah.
But you never adjust to loss.
Right. They always hurt the same, because it was important to always feel a loss and to be reminded that this is to be avoided.
Right.
In the old days, thousands of years ago.
Right.
But that ancient wiring persists, and so it makes us a little bit too prone.
This is why I don't believe in demotions.
I know.
I don't believe in it from a social standpoint because it's humiliating. I also don't believe in it from a prospect theory point. There's just no way that cutting somebody's salary is going to
it's interesting.
Make them feel anything other than pain.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember it's been probably 15 years ago, you told me never demote somebody. And it made sense when you told me, because of basically people never get over it. They never forget, because it's a loss, which we feel, and it's very hard to get over that. But the other thing, which you just mentioned is important, is that it triggers a little bit of that desperation where people normally have a urge to claw it back.
Right.
Yeah. By gambling, by overly gambling.
And there have been times where we've had some employees who we wanted to promote, and like we wanted them to be in a position that would pay them more money. These are people we really loved. And we didn't realize the limitations on their abilities. And so when we did it, they sort of agreed to it because they also, I believe that they also loved us. Like we were a family business. And they get in there, and then like in various ways, like there are two employees in particular, like they were not psychologically able to do those promotions. And it was psychological. It wasn't a matter of capability. And so they came and they're like, I can't do this. And so we put them back to where they were, but they had never really left. Like that would feel like a like a sense of demotion. But first of all, they asked for it, which kudos to them for like recognizing it and then having the courage to disappoint us. And so good on them. But I think the reason why I wouldn't consider that a demotion is like they wanted to go back and they hadn't like adjusted to like the additional salary. It was almost an immediate reaction. But if you had somebody who had been in that job and like maybe they got older and you're trying to hold on to them, like you're better. You don't demote them. You give them like pretty much an entirely different kind of job for the hours that they want.
It may go back in money then in that case.
It may go back in money in that case, but like that's part of the deal. There's going to be pain there. That one's a little bit shaky because there's still going to be the pain of the loss. Yeah,
that's interesting. It reminds me of a long time ago when, and we've done this a couple times since, but basically, sometimes you get in the position where somebody needs to be demoted, but because of all these forces that make demotion terrible on the employee, it's basically because it's so terrible for the employee mentally, it's terrible for the business and for the company. And so we actually a few times in our career advised executives like, okay, give them a demotion, but call it a promotion, give it a different title, pay them the same amount of money, and just move them out of the area that they can no longer do.
Yeah, most of those situations were like they were just technologically lapped.
Yeah.
And so they and not willing or able to catch up technologically. And they were holding back the whole organization because of it.
Yep.
And so in those types of situations, it's like, nobody wants to get rid of their loyal employee.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to demote their loyal employee.
And they want them to have a good ending.
Right.
And some of these employees, not all of them, but sometimes it's an age thing. And they're trying to hold on to, they hit the number for Social Security, which they need to be able to retire. But they actually, as you said, they age out of the job. I wish this wasn't the case, but we see people who they just cannot keep up with the job anymore. Either the job itself is becoming more technologically complicated, or the systems that are like a lot of the places we work, for example, healthcare, they have electronic medical record systems. And every so many years, people move to a new system, and there's a percentage of the senior employees that just don't make it.
Yeah, they can't make it.
They literally cannot move from one electronic health record to another. And in those cases where you have an employee who has been great, and again, I can imagine some people thinking, well, that's crazy. Why would you keep an employee who can't do the job anymore? And my response to that is, I used to think like that. But after 20 years of being in all kinds of businesses, people hold on to employees all the time who can't do the job.
Oh, yeah. The idea that only academia has tenure is complete BS. If you have a tight relationship with your organization, especially in smaller towns, because like everything is so tight socially in a smaller town, like nobody, I won't say they won't fire people. They will fire people who aren't doing their job and could be doing their job. But if you have a track record of being a great employee and they're looking at you and they know that you're doing everything you can, like they're going to try to find a way to accommodate. But sometimes that accommodation just means plucking you out of your current position so you get out of the way of everybody else. And then figuring out how to do that in a way that's face saving, that doesn't cause this loss frame.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Yeah, the only thing I would add is I don't think it needs to be small town. I think
it's more prevalent in small town.
Especially common there. But I mean, I see it. I'm thinking right now of huge city places where they do the same thing, where good employees, loyal, are basically, as you said, they basically have tenure, and sometimes it gets to the point where they can't do the job anymore. And that, back to what started this train of the conversation, is one of the reasons Cindi just brought up to not demote people is that, by the idea from prospect theory, that when people are down, they tend to gamble excessively. And so that's what you get. That's one of the things that you can get when you demote people, is that they're going to try to overly make up for it by taking too big swings at the bat, metaphorically. And that's not good for them or the company either. Yeah, so it's a good point. And so what else about this kind of first plank of loss aversion, of when we're down on our luck and we shouldn't gamble, we're often encouraged to do just that. I would just say sometimes when we talk to people, we recognize this is happening and we just tell them, take the loss. Like, you screwed that up.
Right. Yeah, I guess, I would say that my advice is, like, we oftentimes really fear the loss. Like, we really, really hate the idea of a loss, whatever it is. But with a little bit of experience, you realize it's not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. You can recover.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes it feels like your life is going to fundamentally change with some losses.
Yeah.
And, I've certainly had those moments in my life. And then when you're down, when it happens and you have to reconcile and look at your life after, you're like, oh, it's not that bad down here.
Yeah.
And then you build from there.
Yeah. Yep. Agree. I see, probably think of 10 examples of people who have basically let their boss down. Mm-hmm. And then they're in the coaching session. What they want to do is they want to talk about, all right, what can I do? How do I need to get back to my boss. I need to, I need to get back in front of my boss on a new project. And a lot of times that is loss aversion talking. That is this idea of, I'm down. I need to jump back and get back in front of my boss. And a lot of times we tell them, look, let it go. Give it a little bit and pick a better way, pick a better project than this next one. Pick
right. Don't just grab whatever is at hand. Wait for the thing that actually
right.
you can make a dent on.
Yeah.
Like, make sure it's a good fit. It's almost like, and I don't think that this is necessarily the case. I think that they just do it because they're out of money. But it's almost like Hollywood actors, right? Like, if they've had a great success and then the next one's a bomb, I think,
go too quick to pick the third.
Right.
I got to recover from that.
And you actually want to be the Tom Hanks who, well, I'm not sure he's ever had a bomb. Well, I don't know. Joe versus the volcano. What do we think about that? That might be,
maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
In the box office, I think it still did pretty well, but I don't remember that being a great movie. But you want to, and you take your time. You want to be Tom Hanks and actually pick the movies that you're a good fit.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to overly obsess. Your point is a good one. We just want people to slow down after a loss and not try to too quickly overcompensate.
Make the decision for you.
Yeah.
And not because you're trying to make it up to your boss.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense.
All right, moving along. So holding fast when we ought to actually jump in and take some risk.
Yeah, we see this all the time. Part one that we've talked about is that we gamble when we shouldn't, when we're behind. But part two is that when we're ahead, we stop, or we're reluctant to gamble. Sometimes you and I call this the curse of the middle class or the curse of the golden handcuffs.
Let me give this example. So there's somebody that we have worked with who definitely does not like their profession, and but like, huge bills. So like for the education, which I think that really is a sticky point.
About. Yeah.
And like routinely just really would love to do almost anything other than the actual profession. And we've had many conversations about moving on. And this person is working at a nonprofit. And so they're making a fraction of what they could be making elsewhere. And the reason that they're working at the nonprofit is because in 10 years, their loans will be wiped out. it's guaranteed 10 years of service. And you have to make sure you're making your loan payments on time for 120 payments, which is 10 years.
Yeah.
And then guaranteed your loans get wiped out. And no matter what I did to talk them through the fact that you hate this, and so you're committed
right
to having your loans wiped out with the job before you move on, you might actually have a shorter duration of enduring it if you went with the for-profit business that was paying you top dollar.
Right. And don't worry about the wipeout.
And right. And
you actually pay it off.
Pay it off.
Yeah.
I have never successfully reached that individual.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got the base to gamble. Like all these, that person you're describing, yes, that person has the debt, but these are all comfortable middle class and slightly above middle class. It's not that big a gamble for this guy to leave nonprofit and go to for-profit. We know that he can make probably 60% more.
He's very capable in the profession that he hates. He's very capable. He does some of the hardest stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not as big of a gamble as he's making it out, but he's not leaving.
Because it's a sure thing.
Because he's got a sure thing. I'm going to run this out for another so many years and just grit my teeth and kind of deal with it. And so is like, if you think about stocks, I know this is, people may not think a whole lot about stocks, but it's very hard to do. But they recommend that when you're behind on something, you sell it. Meaning when you're behind, you take your loss and get rid of it. And then when you're ahead, that you actually hold on to that and let it run. And that is a statement of what prospect theory would recommend, but it's very hard to do. Usually we hold the ones we're down on, or we say, oh, this is a great time to buy. Well, no, it's not. This stock is terrible. Why are we buying more of this? And then we sell the one that's running and miss the fact that why are you selling the thing that's actually winning? Let it run some more. And so that's an example of prospect theory for something like stocks, but we see it at work all the time in the work that we do, because we're often, and many of the people listening to this podcast are probably would consider themselves middle class. And so you've got a little buffer, not a huge buffer, but a little buffer. You could gamble more. If you're listening to this podcast and you have a little bit of discretionary income, the part of prospect theory that applies to you is you're probably not gambling enough. You're probably sticking a little bit longer than you should in a job that might not be working as well for you.
Well, and we're using the term gambling. It's not actually, we're not suggesting gambling. Like at work, we're saying maybe take some more risks, but those risks are not a coin toss. Like you have a skill set, you have a network. There's a higher probability. I mean, generally speaking, there's probably the things that you ought to be pursuing. You have a fairly high probability of it actually working out versus gambling, whatever the odds are on whatever type of gambling you're doing. They're not going to be greater than 50-50.
Yeah.
And so we're using the term gambling, but we actually mean risk.
Yeah.
Take risk, take the chance. Because that's the thing with prospect theory is that we have a really hard time with percentages.
Yeah.
And that's how you're running your probabilities. We have a really hard time seeing, okay, I can have $100 or I can have, an 80% chance of $200. And by the time you...
Right, but 20% I go to zero.
But 20% you go to zero. And too many people focus on the 20% going to zero. But also people don't understand that you're basically multiplying 200 times 80% and you're coming out ahead.
Right.
So that's the path that from a mathematics standpoint you should take. And we just don't do a very good job of teaching people how to assess risk.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of things, as you mentioned, where the risk is fairly modest. Like the guy you gave the example of, staying in the same industry, but going from nonprofit to for-profit, that is low risk.
That's like a 99%. I mean, maybe you won't like your boss, but you already don't like your boss.
That's right.
So
you already aren't happy.
Right.
And so you can go and move to a place where you might also be unhappy, but be paid 60% more.
And have to do it for far fewer years.
Yeah. 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 It's a good reminder that, I mean, in future episodes, we'll talk more about risk, but not all risk is created equal.
Hello, musers. Now it's time for a commercial break.
Speaking of risk, strategic planning, 9 sessions, half day. Most strategic plans are not strategic. They're just a list of to-dos without a comparative advantage. If you actually want a strategy, if you actually want a strategic plan that you develop in consultation with one of our experts who knows how to find a strategy from a million competing priorities, call us. It's become our fastest growing single product because it's not your granddaddy's strategic plan. It's coming from you and your people. It will give you a source of leverage. And when you're done, your executive team will be committed to it. Call us for a real strategic plan. OnDemandLeadership.com, OnDemandLeadership.com. Go get yourself a strategy. We try to encourage people to lean more towards the direction of smart risk taking. We never, somebody who's talking to us about, like I'll use an example of a physician talking to us about opening up a restaurant. That is a dumb risk because they don't know anything about restaurants. They don't know anything about, running something on their own.
That basically everything could actually go bad.
And there are odds on restaurants. I mean, right. I don't know what the numbers are, but some.
That's one of the hardest environments to manage if you're not frying up everything.
Yeah. And so it's a very different risk than a physician deciding to take those credentials and move out of the practice of medicine and into the administration of healthcare.
Or there's a whole bunch of different jobs that you could build on that.
Yeah.
You could be working for an insurance company with your expertise. So definitely admin, management, you don't have to necessarily stay.
Yeah.
If you don't enjoy the actual practice of it, you take that expertise and you could apply it somewhere else.
Yeah. And at some point in your career, if you've done a job well enough for long enough and you have a bigger base, you can take larger risks. But the basic insight as it relates to our topic here, loss aversion, is when you have a little bit of a buffer and you can take smart risks, you should. But people don't. People don't take smart risks. I mean, we had a guy who was amazing in the fire service and everybody would always ask him to promote, and he never would. And it wasn't until he was close to retirement that he's like, I should have done that years ago, but I was afraid. And that's loss aversion. I'm excellent at this job. Everybody praises me for this job. I love this job, but I never jump because I'm nervous and I should have.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the flags, right? Like we definitely have a reason. Fear definitely has a use and we shouldn't just blow off fear. But when we know we're making decisions based on fear, we at least need to have a conversation with ourselves about whether or not we're just getting trapped in sort of these biases that happen in the brain, or if we legitimately have a fear.
Yeah. Yeah. My big weakness is skiing. And
boy, is it ever.
Yep.
He's my ski princess.
Definitely a weakness, but it's a weakness I love. And I try to push myself when I ski.
Of course you do.
And so this idea of fear, right? It comes up occasionally in some of the stuff I find myself into. And
wait. Let me just tell everybody how a very good skier describes you as skiing. So this guy like competed in college, and he's taught a lot of people how to ski, and he went skiing with Geoff.
Sparky.
No, not Sparky. Curtis.
Oh, yeah.
He's
Curtis.
described Geoff as having more courage than talent.
That's true.
And that is all I need to know to be terrified.
Yep. Yeah. And so I get myself into stuff with a degree of frequency. And over the years, I've tried to, because I want to be able to ski all season. Because, occasionally this messing around will screw me up and I'll hurt myself, and that'll slow me down for, and ski season is very tight. It's only really a couple good months in the North America. And, if I'm hurt, it's throwing out the whole season. And so I remember trying to push myself in Whistler. I was in Whistler, and there's a few ski places. I mean, this is deep nerd inside baseball for ski nerds. But there's a few places widely known as basically their classification system understates how hard it is. And Alta in Utah is one, Jackson Hole in Wyoming is another, and Whistler in Canada is another. And so we were at Whistler, and I was trying to push myself, and I was looking at a black, which, I do those all day long. Don't tell my aunt, but that's nothing. I'm usually double black.
What do you mean don't tell your aunt? You usually take signs, and they say danger, don't proceed. I
do like to mess with her about that. And then, so I'm at Whistler, and I'm at this black, which, is, again, a regular black is well within my capabilities anywhere else except a place like this. And so I'm sitting here looking at the top of this, and it's got a little drop in, and I'm like, all right, I got this. I'm ready. I can, I know I can do this. It's good. And I'm fixing to do this. And a guy skis up behind me and does the same drop that I'm about to do. And it's ice. And so his skis blow up and all his stuff gets strewn. It's called a yard sale in skiing, and he can't stop. And it's just that telltale scratch all the way down this thing. And I'm like, okay, that's all I need to know. And it was, I think in the last 10 years, I think it's the only time I've ever taken my skis off and walked back to get out of the place that I was in. And that's like, fear is good, a certain degree of fear, but sometimes the universe actually shows you your odds. Like that, like I'm about to do that. I see somebody, he looks like he's better than me, and he blows up. You know what? That's a good reminder. I'm driving past a place. It used to be a restaurant, and I'm like, and I don't know nothing about restaurants. And I'm like, we should buy that place and put it in a restaurant. Well, guess what? Somebody who knew about restaurants had that very space, and they had a restaurant and they couldn't make it work. That is the universe telling you, do not put a restaurant in there. And so sometimes you have to be smart about what a smart risk is. We spend a ton of our time encouraging comfortable people to get a little uncomfortable and take smart career and expertise adjacent risks. And occasionally we have to encourage people, or we have to basically say, look, I know you like the idea of owning a pizzeria, but
it's usually a bar.
A bar.
That seems to be a very popular dream of many.
Yeah. Like we have a buddy, Ned Lavelle. We're actually going to do a podcast with this guy. And
he's amazing.
Yeah, great guy. Like got an MBA and then bought
Hook'em.
Jimmy John's franchises.
Mm.
And him and his partner worked like dogs up at 4 a.m, baking the bread or whatever for years and years and years. And then they sold their Jimmy John's and used that money to buy, to create a brew pub.
Pizza place, brew pub.
Yeah. High-end pizza, high-end beer. And we're smart enough to hire a master brewer. And it's called Pine House Pizza. And then the beer they made was very successful, Electric Jellyfish, and the food was amazing.
They won a lot of awards for the beer.
And they've expanded out to multiple locations.
They're actually in HEB.
They're in HEB with their beer. And people constantly come up to my buddy and basically tell him how to run his pizza place. You should do this with your beer. Have you tried this with your pizza? And they neglect the fact that this guy got up for 12 years at 4 a.m, making Jimmy John's, baking the bread, and then parlayed that knowledge into a gamble, a smart, expertise adjacent gamble.
And by the way, if you can manage a Jimmy John's with people who are probably getting paid minimum wage and reduce the turnover, you are a very good leader. And so that's a hard ground to sort of cut your management teeth on. And if you're good at it, you've got something.
Yeah.
And you'll get people who come up to you and they're like, what they're saying is, I want to do what you did. How did you do it? And in Ned's case, yeah, I mean, that had to have been scary. They really went out on a limb.
Yeah.
But it wasn't they had skills to be able to do this. And so the probability of success was higher.
It wasn't as big of a gamble as you sitting there listening to it think. And that is also loss aversion. People are like, you were making good money doing Jimmy John's. Why did you stop that and start this no name? At the time, no name. It was brand new.
Yeah, they
create a name, create a logo. Why did you basically take this huge risk? And the answer is because it wasn't huge. Because our internal constitution is oversizing how big that risk was for Ned and his partner, Tyler. For you, for me, opening up a brew pub, that is an insane level of risk because you know nothing about brew or pub. And so you're not, why on earth would you be successful? But you get fired, you don't know what to do. And so you scramble to take what savings you have plus a loan to create a brew pub. That is the bad side of loss aversion. Following a loss with a bigger gamble, as opposed to what you and I are talking about, which is talking to people and thinking through, well, what talent, expertise, connections, resources do you have that may enable you to make a smart gamble? And that smart gamble isn't as daunting as you think. That's, I think, the left side, if you will, and the right side of loss aversion that comes from prospect theory.
All right, let's go on to the third element of this conversation, endowment effect.
Yep. Favorite studies, give people a pen, pass out a bunch of pens to MBAs. Ask them before, how much would you pay for a pen? And they say $1.50. Then you pass out pens to them and ask them how much they want to sell it to their classmate. And they say $3.50. Or whatever. You can do it 100 million ways. But basically, as soon as we take possession of something, it could be a pen, it could be a job, it could be a belief that I'm an accountant. I own that. I take possession of that. We start to overweight it.
Well, and honestly, I think it's even more fundamental than that. Like, I think we own ideas.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why criticism hurts so much when it comes at you for ideas, until like you get used to that process. Like the idea is that the process would actually make your ideas better. That's a functional process. But when people are first coming at you, and I shouldn't say criticism, it's more critique. When that first happens, man, does that hurt. That's like somebody walking up to you and telling you your baby's ugly.
Huh.
And it's because of endowment effect. You own those ideas. They are you. And so you put a high value on them. And then when you test it in the market, people are like, well, I don't see that value.
Yeah. 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 And that's why, a lot of times when we're asked to facilitate meetings, we spend some of our time trying to encourage people to look, let's keep moving. Let's get a bunch of ideas out and not have you think that the first idea you put out is the one that we actually have to run with. Because as you said, you're bought into it. You get bought into your first thing, the next person gets bought into their first thing, and it's easy to...
Yeah. Well, the nightmare actually is that and this often happens. I mean, we see this happen all the time with that scenario, is that one person speaks first and they have the idea, and it's not a terrible idea, like in this particular scenario. Sometimes they are.
Yeah.
But in this particular scenario, not a terrible idea. And so then like the social proof starts kicking in. Like somebody's like, yeah, that's not a bad idea. And they start talking about how it's good. And then nobody wants to counter it, even though somebody's sitting right there.
Yeah.
And they got a better idea.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And the other thing is from the research, I think it's Gary Klein, the psychologist Gary Klein, who wrote Streetlights and Shadows and a few other books. But Gary Klein famously proved or showed that the way executives make decisions is basically they talk in collective decisions. They talk until an idea comes up that might work, and then they run it through a few mental checks. And if it passes, they go with it, which we sometimes call one and done, which that as facilitators, we look for that and then push people to not accept the first thing that comes up is plausible and passes a few mental checks, when there might be, as we talked about in a previous issue about narrow framing, other alternatives. And it's back to this idea of we fall too quickly in love with our babies, our ideas, and we fall a little bit too much in love with what we already have. And at the expense of an uncertain possible change that may actually be better. And that's the endowment effect part of loss aversion.
Well, and I think that you have to consider that as a manager too, because to the extent that you're trying to help somebody improve, you got to realize that probably you're on a different page about the quality of, like, say, their work or their ideas. And so it's probably not focusing again, like on the loss part, is probably focusing on where they are and what they've accomplished, like the distance traveled, and recognizing that, and then moving forward with, okay, so how do we get you the rest of the way?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think a lot of times our coaching involves people who basically should leave their job and they don't.
I would say that most of the time we're helping people just get better at what they're doing, or they're solving an acute problem. But I mean, I would say that it's a small percentage, but it's a percentage of people where we're like, yeah, you need to entertain moving on. Yeah.
But that number is maybe 5%, but that's still, I mean, this sounds about right to you. About 1 out of 20 people we talk to actually should move on, and they're not thinking about that.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah. I didn't mean to suggest that it's the majority of our coaching, but I would never have guessed 5% of people. That just seems high.
I think we get it. I think we get the reluctance to move forward and take risk in much more subtle ways, more typically in the coaching. Like, I think we get it where
Yeah.
People are just afraid to ask for something that they need.
Yep.
I'm not even talking about money, just something that they need.
Yeah. And I immediately thought of money. I mean, I'm stunned with the people we know are amazing workers that basically believe the money will come when they'll give me the money.
Actually, I think it could be that they actually have that much faith in their employer, but I also think that it's also possible that they just are really afraid of negotiating.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I don't dispute that at all.
And so I think you've got both of those things at play, but it doesn't even have to be money. I mean, like, I wind up talking to a lot of women, and it's, having whatever flexibility that they need to be able, and it, doesn't have to land on women, but it typically lands on women. And so like more flexibility in terms of, whatever they need to do to be able to get work done while also attending to like some of the random things that come up with raising kids.
Yeah.
And I mean, most people understand that. Most managers at some level understand that. And so it's a conversation about, hey, like when these moments come up, is there something that we can do where like I get the things done that you need me to get done, but I'm also able to basically meet this responsibility that I deeply value. And there are so many employees out there who just aren't even having that conversation. And maybe the answer is no, but maybe the answer is yes. And you just don't know until you have a conversation about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to agree with you. I find that the average person we talk to is underestimating how much influence they actually have with their boss. They're actually selling themselves a little bit short. I
think it's two things. I think they're selling themselves short and feeling like they are a good soldier and just are waiting for orders. And I think they think that their boss is thinking about them a lot more than their boss is thinking about them.
That's right. Yeah, we have the unique perspective of a lot of times we'll be talking to someone and they're talking about their boss, and we actually know them, their boss, and their boss's boss all the way up the top. And we know that these people think this person is a great employee. And we also know that these senior level bosses are just bone crushingly busy. And so this is a good
employee. I don't have to think about them.
Not on the radar.
And to some degree, there's a little bit of and I don't think that people at lower levels understand this. There's a little bit of an expectation from the top that if you're not saying anything, you're good.
Yeah.
And like that goes with like, having to pile on extra work on somebody. And so I have those conversations a lot. Like, look, they're relying, I mean, to some degree, they may not be saying it explicitly, but to some degree, they're relying on you to let them know that like the cup is overfilled. Like they have piled on too much.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you can just throw up your hands and walk away from, or, like shove it all back. But like, you need to be voicing it. Like, this is like, I have more than I can do. So I'm going to need help from you to let me know the parts that I need to prioritize, and the parts that like I can just let come off my plate. And if they're going somewhere else, then let's figure out where they're going. But right now it's too full. There's no way that practically I'm going to get it all done.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's for a reminder of some of these ideas. Go back to our season 1 trash can model of organizations, and how you have to advocate for yourself and your ideas. Yeah. What else you want to say about endowment effect? Basically, we overvalue the status quo.
Yeah, you should always be aware that it's there. So, on a very basic level, when you're presenting ideas, remember that like you love this idea more, but watch, like if you don't think you can handle it emotionally, watch the process that somebody else goes through with getting an idea actually implemented. And you will watch an idea transform into something better. I won't say different, but it will be better. And that is what you want to see. And if you see that and know that, yes, I've got this idea and I really hold it dear, but when I hand it over to the group, it will be better than what I have right now. And then I think that process is a healthier process than you trying to hold tight to the ownership of the idea. You holding tight to that idea means that you're very sensitive and you've overvalued it. If you don't hold tight to it, if you decide that you're going to share it because you have faith that it will get better, I think some of the endowment effect goes away. And then in terms of like the other parts of life, I think you just have to realize that your car probably isn't as valuable as you think it is. Your house probably isn't as valuable as you think it is. Yeah. You know, like the artwork that you chose is probably not as valuable as you think it is. Like we're all doing this. So, you know, just, I think it helps in those scenarios. I mean, like that is actually the value of, say, a real estate agent. They bring a couple of points of value. I know, like, this is kind of like a broader conversation with the internet and, like, you know, what is the value of a real estate agent, right? And so some of it is this access to the MLS, which that has been highly protected and a huge advantage.
That's the multiple listing service.
Yeah, multiple listing service. Because that's data, right? So that's access to data to be able to make better information. And that's one of the main reasons that you want a real estate agent. Another reason is just because it's a process that you probably aren't very familiar with. And it's nice to have an expert to take you through a process you're not familiar with. But this other reason is that, like, it's very painful. If you've ever seen the TV shows where somebody's trying to sell their house and there are cameras all over the house and they're secretly watching the people who are coming in and they're like criticizing the paint and the decorating and like bad mouthing the house as they're walking through it. It's not even that they hate the house. It's just like they're actually in the moment reshaping the house into what they would want. Yeah. But like you can see the person watching this dying on the inside because of the endowment effect. And then they get really mad and then they don't want to sell potentially to the person.
Right.
Because their feelings have been hurt.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good example. Yeah.
All right. So I think that wraps us up. Any parting words before we go?
Smart, gamble more frequently. Those are my parting words. Don't chase too hard after failures and look for smart gambles. On that note, thanks for joining us. And if you can fill in some of those comments or give us some, or subscribe, follow, stars, all that, very helpful. And we want to thank Christina, Sarah, Rebecca, and Shirley, who are out there making the behind the scenes. They're like sort of the Oz behind the whole thing. Yep, on the curtain. And then Design at Work for their help. And hello, Carrie. There you go. I think I'm gonna say that every episode. Do it. I know you're out there, Carrie. Do it. All right. Thank you, everybody. Till next time. All righty. See you later. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about the topic, check out our show notes. And if you want to help us out, like, share, subscribe, and 5 stars are all deeply appreciated. See you next time on The Management Muse.